moment. Vivs, you want to kick it off? Like
Yeah.
introduce
So
why?
excited to have Pavan join us. Pavan Yedavalli. He overlapped with us at UC Berkeley, and we became really close friends over the years. Our kids play together and all that good stuff. Um, and he leads an important team at Wisk, which is a uh, Pav can probably say it better, but urban air mobility. It's an urban air mobility company
Yep.
owned by Boeing, and we thought it would be really great to have a call with him and have a chat with him and talk about how things are going and talk about how he got to where he is. So, um,
Yeah.
with that, Pavan, anything you want to say? Anything you want to share to kick things off?
No, I mean, thanks for the warm introduction. First of all, thanks. I know you guys are kicking. Let's dive right in off, and I'm honored to be your first guest. So hopefully, I can provide some level of entertainment, if nothing else, for the next little bit.
So let's
Yeah,
dive
I
right
mean,
in.
yeah. Let's dive in. I was about to say, Vivek, you forgot the tagline. Let's dive
I
right
thought
in.
I set it up perfectly for you
You
there,
set
Vips.
it up perfectly.
I
Yeah,
just did. I just said it.
you
Okay.
just did it. Pat, we wanted to actually go. We want to go a little way back because we were thinking,
Yeah.
okay, we want to kind of have a kind of conversation. We were also very curious about some things
Hmm.
and that starts before you got into urban air mobility, and
Yeah.
we wanted to go back to actually how you decided to go to Cal. Like, and you're coming from
Mm.
Ohio, you know,
Yeah.
you're both from California. Obviously, we have this like built-in perception of Berkeley. So we're
Uh-huh.
curious, what is the perception of Cal from somewhere like Ohio when you're deciding? Like, what is it like to think, oh, I could go to Cal, and you're talking to your friends about that? Or what's the perception of Cal, and was it a close decision? Like, were there a couple other universities in the mix that you were like about to
Yeah.
choose
Totally.
between, or was it pretty clear cut?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a good question, and I'm gonna have to remember a little bit, but a few things like first of all come to mind. The first thing is Cal is not very well known outside of that word because it's really Berkeley as an academic institution. A
Whoa.
lot of friends of mine actually were like, we didn't know Cal and Berkeley were the same university. And it's
Mhm.
like, so it's actually kind of funny because Cal, in my mind, has always like alluded to the athletic department and like the athletic image of Berkeley, and Berkeley is like the academic institution. And so with that, like whenever friends, family, etc., like knew Berkeley, it was like Berkeley, UC Berkeley, sometimes University of California, but I think even that was like not entirely clear. Like sometimes it wasn't even well known that it was a public university, right? It was like, on the West Coast, it's like Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, right? Those are like the major schools and like especially in engineering, right? So with that, yeah, I mean, I did have like several options. One thing that really stressed everything was that I have cousins in the Bay Area. And so we had come out to it. We come to San Francisco and like the Bay Area like several times before that. But I think it was like junior year. I was looking at Berkeley and Stanford and we wanted to come out. We visited family. And I think it was at that time that it's like you can feel a little bit of magic in the air. Like I always grew up like loving technology, loving machines, loving vehicles. It's like you can kind of see that with Tarek too. But it's like I grew up like really loving that. Like I remember I used to read you remember like Walt Mossberg, right? The famous journalist who did like things on Steve Jobs, like all these types of things. And he used to be the tech columnist, if I recall correctly, at Wall Street Journal. And so like whenever we read the Wall Street Journal, like I used to always just like go to that page. Like I didn't care about stocks, I didn't care about any of like the money stuff. I cared about like the
Yeah.
technology stuff. So I was just like really into computers, really into phones, and like all these things that were coming up. And like once I had come out here on that visit, it was like we obviously knew Berkeley and Stanford and Silicon Valley and the Bay Area were like the mecca of technology, of engineering, and of like computer science in particular. And like once I came out here, you could kind of tell a little bit that it's like it's in the air. You breathe this notion of like software can cure the world, or like technology can cure the world. And I don't even know if I have any examples of why I felt like that, but it just felt like as you kind of stepped on campus. Like you see like the Nobel Prize winners, you see the Turing Award winners, you see like these enormous departments where you're like, hey, like everyone says, it's like that's where Wozniak and Jobs had their whole thing. Like they just had coffee and developed Apple, and you're like, it's like Apple to most people is like the phone maker, but Apple for us, I feel like is like more than that. It's an ecosystem. It's like a business. It's innovation. It represents so much. So I mean, kind of with all that, like I kind of fell in love with Berkeley, like because it not only had obviously like that technological engineering component, obviously being like one of the top schools, but um, it's also super well known outside of the Bay Area. It's not just, an engineering school or just like, one of the best schools. It's like a political place.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
like historically a ton of the Berkeley mindset, it kind of like that was what like really struck me is that once I came out here, right? It's like my dad's a professor at Ohio State, right? But it's like the like ravenous political culture even in our time, like 40 years later, after like the counterculture and like, Berkeley politics movement, you can still kind of feel it, right? It's like it's part of the DNA a little bit,
Yeah.
and I think that really helped like solidify that it's like this is like the type of environment that I want to be in, like where they're socially, like they socially care, but also like technologically are like trying to be responsible. So that like
Yeah,
really
there's
did it. Like,
this
yeah,
I was just gonna say there's this element that I've talked to people at other universities, particularly like Ivy Leagues, that you go in there and there's this like stodgy view of what you have to do to be successful at an Ivy League.
yeah,
Like you need to join an eating club and then you need to do these extracurricular activities. It's like very prescribed the path to being successful at an Ivy.
yeah,
Whereas at Berkeley, I feel like you get this energy of like you could go there and you can do anything. It's like
yeah.
you don't have to follow some pre-prescribed path to do something and be like successful. You can find any friend group you want. You could sit on your couch your whole day if you wanted. Like so I
Totally.
think that energy is really powerful. Also, if you're in your mindset where you're like, I kind of have an open idea of what I want to do. I think
Yeah.
engineering is the right thing, but what I do with that, anything, what kind of friends I want to make, what do I want to do? Extracurricular, like very open feeling. And
Yep.
I think that, at least for me, drew me to Berkeley. Like, I think everyone who leaves Berkeley is like, oh my God, amazing. That was like exactly what I
Yeah.
wanted out of the school. So, I mean, one thing I wanted to just follow up on was you said, you always were kind of into the engineering side, like looking at the
Mhm.
drawings in a magazine or like whatever it is,
Mhm.
thinking how things work. Like, is that dad's influence kind of coming in to you, or is that like something more inherent to you even than that? Like, it wasn't kind of what you guys would talk about. It was just like in your head
Yeah,
somehow.
it's a good question. I think like there's no denying that there's dad's influence in there. It's kind of funny because like dad being like a professor of aerospace engineering, like I used to love planes. We used to go do all sorts of things with planes, but it's like in the grand scheme of things, like the machines that I really liked were like computers more than planes. But then here, fast forward to today,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a mix of both, right? So it's like
Mhm.
I can't deny dad's influence. And I think it's probably pretty standard trope that it's like the science math always enjoyed that, right? And it's like this is like the full application of that, like just engineering in general of both of those things. So I think that probably came from dad and my brother and my mom. My mom has like a very like theoretical, like sociological lens to things. So she always used to come in not necessarily like from a scientific or engineering perspective, but more from like a societal thing, and that kind of hits too coming to Berkeley, right? Because it's like it's
Mhm.
everything, right? Like every
Mhm.
possible perspective, like hitting on the same topic, and it's pretty cool. Because I like one thing that actually really resonated with Berkeley that I think actually developed when must have been later when later in our college time, but Citrus, which is like it's like this research consortium, but it's like it literally stands for like Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. It's like
Mm.
it covers
Yeah, yeah,
everything from like engineering, but like making it real to society. And I really just like feel like that's like Berkeley in a nutshell, right?
yeah, 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 yeah. Not that
Um,
just can we do it, but should we do it? Is it good for us
exactly,
to do this thing? One
exactly.
thing we were also thinking about, and Vivs, I'll let you jump in a second. I want to make sure we're getting to like, I feel like you'll ask the more interesting questions. I'm just asking the background stuff. But
No, no, no.
like, we were wondering, like you're in electrical engineering and computer science, huge field, right? Like you could choose this
Yeah.
range of things within the field, but you kind of
Not to
hone
mention
in,
one of the more difficult majors at Berkeley is EE and CS. It's like a pretty big deal to even get into it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But you kind of like, this wide ecosystem. We are all taking CS classes and EE classes, and it's like you kind
Yeah.
of start to hone in on signal processing a little bit,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And then you even go get your master's, right? Diving
Yeah.
deeper into that, start a PhD in that, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, and we'll get into how that transitioned off in a sec after. But like,
Yeah.
what was signal processing? What made that incredibly
Mm.
interesting? Like, what makes
Yeah.
that field super interesting to you, and just generally? And yeah, let's just start there. What was it? What was it about signal
Wow.
processing?
So it's interesting because I signal processing is math, right? Like plain, like pure, plain and simple. It's math, and it's like more complex math that involves things like Fourier transforms, things that are trying to play this game between like the time domain and the frequency domain. So it's like wrapping your head around that was particularly complex for me, but it's like just generally I found that interesting because ultimately it was the foundation of things that felt somewhat magical. So what like the reason I say that is because like from signal processing, I delved into wireless communications or just like wireless systems in general. And like I feel like I've told people this, but it's like even knowing how it works, it's still quite magical to me that we're able to do this. We're able to transfer files. We're able to talk. We're able to produce video at real time from thousands of miles away, from like in real time, and using these devices in our pockets. And it's like, even knowing how exactly that works, it's still mind blowing that that's possible. Like, and that's kind of like rooted in like signal processing is the foundation of that. So I actually got very interested in wireless more broadly, and then kind of like backing it up further. It's like, oh, all this is based on digital signal processing, on on like sampling, on discrete time signal processing, all these things that are super relevant to wireless communications. And then that's kind of how it built up, because like basically I used wireless communications as the goal to understand, and then these are kind of the foundational steps, I'd say.
And then, um, so that takes us to kind of another sort of inflection point, I think, where you did change a little bit from that to going to do your PhD
Huh.
in something a little bit different,
Mhm.
and ultimately to where you are today. So maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, how did you get there?
Yeah. So it's interesting because basically after I had done my master's at Columbia, I worked for a wireless communication startup for about 6, 7 years. And then the biggest thing was that startup, we were doing wireless backhaul, or basically like long distance, non-line of sight wireless communication at high throughputs. And the way that you could do that at high throughputs was leveraging science and engineering feat called beamforming, which is essentially trying to make electromagnetic waves that are in proximity of one another at the same frequency, make them basically constructively interfere with one another. And when they constructively interfere, they're essentially at the same phase that increases the amplitude. And then as the amplitude increases, then you can get a higher signal to noise ratio, which then can lead to a better conversion to more bits per second being delivered. So like without going into too much detail of that, the whole idea was that steer the beam where you need it to go, and then you could get extremely high data rates out of that wirelessly. So it was considered like a an alternative to fiber optics,
Pavan,
which are extremely high data rate. Yeah.
before you keep going, I've always wondered something about this, which I've never been able to fully understand, which is like, let's say I take 2 points, as a sender and a receiver, and I'm sending a signal between them. I'm probably going to get a lot of bounce off of different things, right? I'm going to get like a
Yeah.
bounce off of a building, a bounce off of a cloud, whatever it is. And when
Yeah.
I form that signal back at the receiver, how do you know you're not going to get like half phase waves from
Yeah.
that distance from like the cloud or the building that's going to interfere? Like, how do you prevent those
So
distances from?
yeah, so multipath, like the multiple bounces off of obstacles that are kind of in the way. So that's called multipath. And the whole idea actually is that you are essentially receiving those noisy signals as well. And as the transmitter is receiving those noisy signals, you are essentially creating another wave to undo that. And
Mm,
that's what ends up happening, where it's like you're essentially making the noise destructively interfere while making your signal continue to be constructively interfered with. So it's like you try to consider all options, or like, yeah, all the potential solutions to where you need it to go, and there will be multipath, and you do your best to overcome that multipath. But essentially, by having the way beamforming works is that you need to have multiple antennas in an antenna array.
mm,
So each of these antennas is kind of, while they're contributing to the overarching beam that you want with the signal, they're also helping to undo any potential obstacles and interference too.
It
mm.
it this is where my my lack of engineering know-how is maybe going to show. But is this kind of in the Wi-Fi or like the wireless world? Is this similar in the sound world to like sound canceling or noise canceling headphones, where they send out waves to cancel out so that the actual like sound kind of disappears?
Yeah, I mean, just like in very simple terms, absolutely, right? It's like ultimately sound is a wave, and then you are trying to get rid of all the other noise that, it's like in sound, you still have the notion of signal to noise ratio, and you're trying to make sure that everything is what you want. You keep everything that you want and get rid of everything that you don't want. And like a really simple way that I always remember how to look at it is like this notion of like a transfer function. You put X into the system and you get Y. But you don't, like, you have the system. So essentially, if there's any other stuff in that system, you kind of just make it like the reciprocal of the system to get back what you want, right? So then that's what you're trying to build. So it's like Y is going to be slightly different from X, but you want Y to be as close to X as possible, right? So you're trying to build a system that essentially is like X goes into system, comes out as X2. They call it X hat because it's not going to be perfect, but it comes pretty close.
That's
What
awesome.
what is the like sales application for this? Are you trying to get rid of, or is this trying to get rid of the wires between poles or like the last mile wiring
Yeah.
problem? What
So
actually
it's
buys
kind
that?
of funny because we talked about this just the other day, right? That it's like at the time that I was at the company, the whole idea was to provide a low cost, high throughput alternative to fiber. This was like early tens basically, where the iPhone was starting to become ubiquitous, just a smartphone in general. And then the applications that were coming onto the smartphone were starting to become very high throughput, very high bandwidth applications. YouTube, Netflix was coming. There were also, just like FaceTime started coming in soon, and like things like, the video conferencing, those types of things. So extremely high bandwidth applications were starting to come online with the kind of advent and ubiquity of the smartphone. And so at that time, the whole idea was that, look, the infrastructure, and that actually kind of leads to what was next for me, but it's like the infrastructure for communication, for digital communication, was lacking. And we had the end to end. You guys had your iPhones, I had my iPhone, but none of it matters if the weakest link from my phone to the router to the tower to the next tower, if all any of those links doesn't reach the
Mm.
capacity that it's supposed to, then the like our entire signal is lost. So, you're only as good as your weakest link, right? And so that's what we were trying to solve at that time, which is like, but which is basically like try to fix all of the weak links across the communication grid cheaply, but still having a high throughput, high bandwidth type of solution. So that's what I did at the time. and it was supposed to be like an alternative to fiber at the time. I'll be totally honest, I don't exactly know what the company is focusing on from like a go-to-market perspective these days, but all I know is that at that time, this big cellular providers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint at that time were the big ones, like Deutsche Telekom, Rogers, forget the one in India. But yeah, a lot of those major cellular providers, and then like ISPs like Comcast, Cox, all of these like major ones also were interested. So I would imagine that it's probably still somewhat similar, but maybe not. I don't know.
So yeah, maybe how did you transition that, or even parlay that into what you're doing today?
Yeah,
And
so
what is what you just say it for everyone?
so right. So I mean, just like super quickly, after doing the startup work, then I tried to leverage beamforming for other applications, specifically with power. And so, I started my PhD at Columbia looking at wireless power applications, and yeah, basically from that, it was like there was some really interesting research. I was more of like doing the software hardware integration, a lot of the signal processing, and like the programming associated with creating the overall like network level system. I was really interested in doing that for a long time. My advisor was much more interested in like the theoretical aspects of it all. So at that time, I wasn't particularly interested in that, but I did build a bit of a prototype to do long distance wireless power, which was about like 10 feet. And it was pretty cool because we leveraged beamforming to do that.
You could
I actually,
does that mean you could like
yeah. What's
charge
that?
your
Sorry.
phone? You could like, does that mean you could like charge your phone or something from 10 feet
S-
away?
Yeah, so basically, once we got to like this long distance wireless power like prototype, then I started getting interested more in like, all right, what are the use cases? And then it was at that time where it's like the natural use case was like, yeah, charging your laptop, charging your phone, um, which were like pretty good use cases for wireless charging in general. However, what I found was, so basically after this I had done, I like stopped doing the PhD, and I actually wanted to go a little more entrepreneurial with all of this. So I ended up raising I think it was like 50,000 from the NSF actually to do like customer discovery for this like deep tech solution of wireless power to see like what we could do and like if there are any applications that could exist. This is called the NSF iCore program at the time, which I think is actually still going. But long story short, there was that we ended up finding out, like we tried to explore wireless power for drones. So we went through an entire process, and Vivs, I know you would find this super interesting, that like we had this technology, it was very nascent, right? It was research grade technology, and we needed a lot more to actually make it like a product and actually make it valuable to the market. So we explored, all right, what could wireless power be used for? And then what we found was that a lot of people were very scared of long distance wireless power because of radiation in their homes. So the consumer application was actually really challenging to overcome. So like the
Oh,
phones, the laptops, it's like just generally there was a fear of it. I'll say right now that it's like it's not exactly founded, because this is non-ionizing radiation rather than ionizing radiation. So
mm.
with that being said, it's like heat does occur with waves. So it's like if there's enough heat from all these waves, then that could obviously cause problems.
Sort of
But
heating
typically
up
that
an
doesn't
area of
happen.
your house, and that's a little scary, right? Like
Yeah.
there's like
Yeah.
there's this
So
device that's
like we
causing.
kind of I like kind of
Yeah.
pivoted from consumer applications to like, all right, this is still really interesting work. How do we move it to industrials? And then so that's where we started exploring drone applications. We knew that endurance is a huge problem with drones. We knew that they're typically used for like industrial applications like surveillance, or for, precision ag, or, things like delivery, right? Like just things that are not necessarily like truly right near the person. And then we found a lot of interest, but the reality was that we talked to a ton of drone companies, like a ton of just small scale UAV, larger scale passenger urban air mobility as well. And that kind of started piquing my interest. What we found, obviously, is at that time, which was 2018, no one had really operationalized drones in their ecosystem. Everyone kind of acknowledged that, hey, yeah, endurance is a problem, but like we don't use drones that efficiently and that at scale to warrant needing this solution. So, kind of with all that, it's kind of funny because even now in 2024, I wouldn't say that drones are operationalized at all, right? So like we were very early then, and honestly, if I did it again today, it still would be early. Um, but that's what piqued my interest in urban air mobility. Like once I got into drones, and I was like, oh, there's like this passenger application, and then that kind of opened up a whole bevy of like old thoughts and interests where I was just like, look, I've always cared about transportation. I've always cared about cities. I've always cared about like, just the built environment in general and how transportation like plays its role in there. Like, you know, airplanes, trains, planes, automobiles, right? It's like all those things were like, oh man, this is so cool. And then from there, that's when I started like looking at potential like programs that and like advisors and things like that where I could start like exploring this concept, like just transportation in cities a little bit more. So that's how I got into what I do now.
So I'm just gonna share the screen really quick here just to show what are we even talking about? Because I don't know if UAM is like a universally known like concept. And so oh, I can't really do it. Hold on. Share my screen. Yeah, here we go. So I'm just going to share my screen and show the website of where you work, which is Wisk.
Hmm.
This is kind of a look at, it looks like generation 6 of this
Yep.
urban air mobility vehicle, or I don't know, how would you talk about it?
So I think we talked about this the other day that it's like I don't know if we got the acronyms correctly in the industry, but yeah, UAM is urban air mobility, AAM is advanced air mobility, so that typically includes drones as well, like small scale UAVs, and then the actual aircraft that we work on is called an eVTOL, which is an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Um, that's what the aircraft is known as, is eVTOL. We at Wisk, we are trying to develop the first autonomous eVTOL to be fully certified by the FAA. And that's what you're seeing here is that Gen 6 aircraft. That's going to be the one that we're going to fly next year with its first flight. And, we're going to certify it and actually commercialize that aircraft right there. So it's pretty exciting. It's fully autonomous. Yeah, like that's John right there. He's our head of autonomy. Um, and what I do is it's kind of fun because it's been kind of a really direct translation of my PhD work, which was essentially developing large scale micro simulations to understand what our deployments should look like and what our demand would look like for an airline operation, what our operational metrics could look like. So what sort of cadence we would need between vertiports in our network and what sort of fleet sizes, what our schedules could look like, what sort of personnel requirements we'd need, and essentially what sort of vertiport configurations and everything we would want. So all of that gets like translated into, all right, how much ridership can we get? What sort of aircraft do we need to design for to maximize ridership? And what sort of infrastructure needs do we need to make this a reality at scale? And so we do a ton of large scale simulations to understand demand, operations, inform aircraft designs, and we're also like very coupled with the business model. So essentially, any deployment in any of our go-to-market cities across the world, we can basically create what our network can look like early on entry into service, like with a couple of vertiports, to what we envision this whole thing to look like in the future. Tens, 20, who knows how many vertiports, and then we can basically see what our costs could look like, what our revenue could look like through our business model as well. So that's the work that I do, and that's the what our team does just more broadly. So it's really exciting stuff, and it kind of just translates directly from my PhD, which is really fun.
Yeah, so maybe say as much as you're allowed to, but like
Yeah,
how's it going? Like, are you working with actual cities to deploy this stuff,
yeah,
or what does it
yeah,
look like?
yeah. So
When can I ride?
so basically the answer is yes, where it's not just the aircraft, right? We're trying to develop the entire ecosystem. And that ecosystem requires many things outside of the aircraft. First of all, the infrastructure. So these vertiports that we're talking about, we can kind of liken them um, to subway stations or train stations, right, in cities where there's dedicated infrastructure for aircraft to take off and land, and for there to be like a terminal service. So, I kind of call it a mix between an airport and and a subway station. Is like, you know,
Hmm.
you have all of the requirements of the airport, but it's at a smaller scale that is like kind of at that micro daily scale. So we need to do a lot of work with vertiport developers and with local stakeholders. So like public agencies at the city level, they do things like environmental reviews, noise reviews. They're historically in transportation, you don't want to, like, certain communities like having transportation nearby. Some communities don't want any transportation nearby, and like you need to fight those things as well. So there are a lot of ecosystem challenges associated with infrastructure and with airspace. The FAA kind of holds the final word on airspace, but obviously you need to work with communities, and they work with communities to make sure that's like as safe as possible, as little disruption as possible as well to the communities. So we've worked publicly. We've announced work in Houston, in the greater Houston area, as well as LA and Long Beach. We're obviously exploring a ton of other cities, and we'll be announcing those soon enough. But yeah, no, it's I would say that it's I obviously have it might be a little biased, but it's happening. Some of our friends and competitors, they're going to do piloted versions first, so they'll be going to market first. Hopefully in the next like couple of years, next year or two, and we'll see it in action. And because we're fully autonomous, we're going to come a little bit later. But the
How
whole idea is that we all believe that scale will be unlocked with autonomy. And that's the industry understanding.
how do you decide whether what two levels of questions? I think one is how do you decide whether you want to saturate a city and make it like perfect in terms of number of vertiports and everything that would need, let's say Houston, just go all in on Houston,
Yep.
and there's a vertiport, I don't know, you tell me, on every corner, every bus stop, something like that. And then the second
Hmm.
part of that question is, would it look like the airport model where you have different airplanes that all dock at the same airport? Like there's a shared infrastructure, but there's different planes that use that shared infrastructure? Or do you expect every company to build out their own network of vertiports and everyone's just playing the infrastructure game themselves too?
So it's a really, really good question, and it's something that there are multiple answers to right now. I think many of the players in the industry expect shared infrastructure and cooperation at this shared infrastructure. Um, how the infrastructure is shared, is it like a gate and terminal system where essentially, United has that terminal and Southwest has this terminal? Is it like that, or is it actually even the infrastructure itself is kind of time based, where it's like the Joby aircraft is coming in, it leaves, then the Wisk aircraft comes to the same spot, then it leaves, then the Archer aircraft comes to the same spot, and then it leaves. So there are a lot of paradigms that are being explored. We anticipate shared infrastructure, and to be totally frank, we want shared infrastructure because that is less cost to the ecosystem just more broadly, and it allows for more services, right? It's like the more transportation, the more offerings with UAM there are, the better in my mind. However, there are certainly players who are trying to do like exclusive use vertiports, is what they're called, where it's like, yeah, that is theirs, and that's what they want. There's totally like business merit to that as well, but at the same time, you gotta understand how much growth you can get from a revenue perspective with all the costs that you incur being exclusive use. And one thing that's like just so painfully important is the locationing of these vertiports. Because Arv, you and I have talked about this before, but it's like if you don't find that multimodal journey from home to the vertiport, flight, and then the last mile from destination vertiport to your final destination, if that is not seamless and incredibly convenient, it's going to be challenging to find to like offer a truly valuable service to people. So locations are everything, and that's a lot of what our simulations do. Also, is like where's all the travel demand coming and going to, um, but there are feasibility constraints, right? It's like there's a ton of people going downtown, but there are a ton of skyscrapers downtown. There are a lot of people underflowed downtown, so a lot of technical challenges that we need to sort of balance.
One more on that note is from an economics perspective, right? Let's say that you truly want this to transform urban infrastructure and urban mobility. Feels like to me the price point has to be pretty low in
Yeah.
order for like and but if I look at airplane costs, that would be way too high for the average person to just be like, hey, I'm going to save 20 minutes, want to take a an eVTOL. So
Yeah.
how do you like personally think about, is this going to be a solution for the masses, or is this going to be a solution that takes the top 5% of cars off the road and that's going to alleviate traffic enough to make a difference? Like what's the true benefit
Yeah.
to the urban mobility situation?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think there are a couple of ways that we can look at this. I think the first thing is that we need to first of all, we're exploring different pricing options. We're exploring different costs across the board to see what makes sense for the business. In an ideal world, this would be absolutely available to the masses at Uber prices, right? And one thing is that we don't have a lot of my research, like my PhD research from Berkeley, we found from all these simulations that the amount of congestion that you relieve is going to be fairly paltry, even at scale. It's like it won't be more than a percent or two off the road, and there's also the induced demand. So if people find that the road is now more open, more people will start driving. So it's not necessarily that that's what will happen, that we're going to relieve congestion. Really, the idea is that you provide a mode that quickly goes from A to B, right? It's like right now we have a variety of modes that offer different services. And the mere fact that we have congestion means that essentially demand is stripping away supply or outstripping supply in such a way that we can capture some level of the market that might want to do something differently to get from A to B. And so the whole idea is providing a different option in like the multimodal transportation network. And the problem, of course, is that, yeah, if this is a very expensive service to operate, then prices will have to be inherently high, like cost-based or value-based pricing. So they'll have to inherently be higher. And so it's going to be a really interesting challenge to figure out how to make it more for the masses while still being able to provide the service that we claim we can provide. So like just as an example, to your point, if we actually had low prices, that are comparable to driving and parking, or like, driving with a toll and parking, et cetera, then, there would be a significant amount of demand. But the problem is that we also have an operational constraint, right? It's like there can be hundreds of thousands of potential travelers, but due to fleet size requirements, due to vertiport infrastructure requirements and sizing requirements, due to personnel requirements, all these things start actually limiting the number of actual passengers we can serve, unless you're able to figure out more vertiports, more, like more creatively designed vertiports. So it's like there's actually like an operational challenge there. But outside of that, the bigger thing is we need to just bring costs down significantly to make it a real mode for the masses. And the way we're expecting to do that is through autonomy. And so if we have autonomy, then I would say that we can definitely do that. But I think we're exploring multiple use cases where it's not just like direct to consumer, but there could be potentially like corporate strategy, right? Like corporate partnerships. In the same way that in the Bay Area, we have the Google buses going down, or the Genentech buses going down, or the Meta buses going down from SF down to the peninsula. Same sort of thing we can start thinking about where it's like they're still in traffic for an hour each way, right? Like one of our friends, right? It's like he literally like was in traffic down 101 like 4 hours a day. And it's like, we know that that's a huge problem. So there could be a scenario where now we can start thinking of different models to actually start transporting people quickly and safely. So it's like, the direct to consumer, I think it's a tough one. And I think I'm like excited to crack that nut, but I also think there are a variety of other options where this can be viable. And I think that probably goes to a lot of the interest that you might have in this, Vivs, where it's like, yeah, it's like thinking of different use cases, thinking of different go-to-market strategies. It's like that. We kind of get brought into that a lot, which is kind of fun too. So like a lot of
Yeah,
our
I mean,
stuff informs that.
there's a part of this that is also you're already working with the big cities, some of the big cities. So
Yeah.
can they foot the bill for certain things, right? Like they maintain subway infrastructure in New York and have to deal with that, right? Is there some demand for this, enough demand for this that it would make sense for cities to take it on? Or
So that's a like probably one of the key points, right? Is that transportation infrastructure more broadly has been heavily publicly subsidized, heavily. So what we need to do as an industry is exactly what you're saying. We need to convince these public entities that this is worth subsidizing pretty heavily. And how
I
we
mean,
do that,
I know it's coming up really, really soon, but basically, LA is hosting the Olympics in a
hmm
few years.
hmm yep,
So, what are they going to do? Right?
yeah,
They already have issues. In order to go like 5 miles in Los Angeles in any direction, it takes like 45 minutes or something crazy. So,
right,
like, now you're going to have all these athletes trying to shuttle between different venues, and you're going to have hundreds of like thousands and thousands of people visiting the city from all over the world to go watch the Olympics. Like, we saw in Paris, right? It's like nowadays it's so, I mean, like people come from everywhere to watch, and there's
yeah,
so many different sports and so many things that people are interested in. And so I think it's going to be a serious, serious question for cities like that where the actual operations day to day are just so cumbersome that
yeah,
it's you would even think of like, why would they even choose that city? And as an LA as a brand, that's bad for your city.
yeah.
So what will you spend to solve that problem, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
actually related to the Olympics, I think it was the IOC as well as the like, city of LA and the Greater Metropolitan Planning Organization that announced car-free Olympics. What that
mm,
in 2028. So what that means in practice is that they're intending to have all of the venues from like the Olympic Village to every single one of the actual venues where all the events are taking place be available to go to and from with some public transportation. I don't know what that public transportation will be necessarily. I think they're building a new line of the LA Metro. They're going to have obviously probably like expanded bus service. They're probably like there is a lot of discussion about at least a few of the entrants in UAM being a part of the solution.
yeah,
So the whole idea is like how do we convince cities that this is worth it? It's the sustainability angle. The equity angle is tough, like realistically, right? It's like we're following the Tesla model where it's like the goal is that yeah, early on it's going to be an expensive service, but hopefully soon enough, with as we scale, costs will come down enough that more of the masses can afford it. So
I mean,
maybe later on,
that's just
equity
the way
can be a
things work,
problem.
right?
Can be solved. But sorry, say again.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's just the way things work. To As a reminder, that's how it was for airlines, right? Like,
Right.
that's how a lot of these technologies over time become democratized, but start off with, they're expensive. So there's like a barrier to entry for for people to actually use the service.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, those are probably like sustainability, equity, and just like being able to offer a mode that augments the current transportation network that's less toward car centric infrastructure is pretty palatable to cities just more broadly. So we'll see how that goes, but I do think, to your point, the publicly subsidized infrastructure is definitely a major thing that we're going to have to explore, continue to explore.
So
So we got.
we're running up against time here. Sorry, Arvin, do you want to get
I
one
was
last
going to say
question?
we're running up against time, but I
Yeah,
got one question for
yeah,
you,
one last question. Yeah.
in particular for SF and mobility and how it relates to a little bit of what you're saying. SF just voted to close the Great Highway, turn it into a park. And you're
Mhm.
obviously a slow street, what do you call it? Slow street aficionado, but you have some role in your slow street. What do you call yourself?
I always called it visionary, but
Wow,
that.
visionary. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. All right, you're a slow street visionary. So, like, how do you think about shutting the streets down, slowing them down, versus the reality that a lot of people have cars, and if you make the city too inconvenient, it starts to get worse for like daily life for a lot of people. What's your line there until we all have EV tolls that we can hop into and just
Yeah.
avoid the streets? Like, how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, no, I think it's a challenging problem because obviously you need to think about what's necessary to to improve quality of life now versus what the vision is in the future. And I think like one of the major things that I think about is the like kind of inextricable relationship between transportation and land use. You know, we're all stuck in the thought process of needing to use the car to do something, right? It's like ultimately travel is a derived demand, right? It's like a lot of people enjoy, driving their car or, taking a flight even, taking the train. People do enjoy that, but typically travel is like you are doing it to do something else. And I think that's actually something that we need to start thinking about a little bit more. That right now, the reason we drive is because things are far away. The reason that we are, and that's not coincidental either, right? Especially in this country, like the 40s, 50s, 60s actually built our society such that we were more dependent on the car, from a variety of federal bills, from the automobile lobby, from all sorts of things that I know we don't have time to get into. But with all of that being said, I think it is important to think about how we can start reimagining the built environment a little bit. That's why things like housing, like this great highway discussion, is actually not a real discussion until we talk about housing in San Francisco also. This is low hanging fruit in my mind, which I don't necessarily think is the right order of operations because like they're taking away something, but what are you giving? Right? It's like they didn't build a new line in Muni to get out there. They didn't
Hmm.
cross cut, they didn't create,
Yeah.
in the end, the west side, all of Inner Sunset, all of Outer Sunset, all of Sunset just in general is single use residential zoning for the most part.
Hmm.
And when that happens, then you have to be dependent on your car to go to the mall, to go to get food, to go get something else, to go to a bar, to go to a restaurant, right? It's like you have to. And so I certainly empathize with the notion that they need the car, like residents of that area. But at the same time, I also do want to think about what we do envision for that neighborhood and San Francisco just more broadly, right? It's like if we turn that side of the west side of San Francisco near the Great Highway into high rises and all sorts of mixed land use, where there are bars, restaurants, cafes, all sorts of things, all of a sudden having a park right on the water doesn't sound like such a bad idea, does it? Right?
Hmm.
And at the same time, on the east side here at the Embarcadero, we used to have a highway on the Embarcadero. And just think about there was a highway in front of the ferry building for decades before Loma Prieta brought it down, actually, or like, the start of it. It got damaged, and then they were like, there's a whole movement to get rid of it. And now we have a beautiful waterfront on the east side of San Francisco. So I do like kind of think that we need to think a little bit more long term, acknowledging that there is sacrifice right now. And that, if we have that type of like collective vision, I think we could really transform San Francisco and other cities that, you know, have this type of amazing richness to it. So, you know, that's my
Yeah,
take on it right
that's
now.
so
That it's
good. Yeah,
just like kind of wait, you know, it's like be
yeah.
patient, trust the process almost, right?
Yeah.
Trust the process. All right. Well,
And
hey, dude,
so,
that's a perfect cap off.
yeah, and
Thank you for
let's cap
chatting
it
with us.
there. But insofar as you want to be found, or people want to learn more about you, or learn more about Wisk, or whatever the case, like, what's the best way to follow you, get in touch with you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I technically am on Twitter and Instagram and stuff, but that's probably a decent place, but probably not actually. But I can provide my like email address and all sorts of other ways to contact me. So I appreciate the platform, guys. It's fun, you know, as
Yeah,
you can tell. I
you're
can.
our first one, so thanks for being our guinea pig, our guinea Pavan.
Yeah, of course. I know. It's like I could talk about this all day. So apologies, and you know, in retrospect.
No, that was great.
No,
That
this
was
was great.
awesome.
It's so
Thank you,
nice to
man.
learn from
Yeah.
you.
Appreciate it,
All
guys.
right.
All right.
I'll
All
talk
right,
Have a
to you.
good one.
Bye.
All
bye.
right, bye.
Signing off.
Bye.